happening there, and who can we expect as part of those that will be listening intently to this lecture?
Well, certainly people making their way into the auditorium where we'll have the UN Executive Secretary, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, will be delivering the lecture this year and telling you, just looking at how people are dressed up, if you've seen the visuals of people going to go watch Wakanda, I'm telling you that today is Wakanda Forever that's taking place here. People dressed quite interestingly with some vivid colors, which obviously speaks to this continent's beauty and the continent of Africa, the continent that we celebrate today, but also, of course, the foundation and the founding of the OAU, which is also being celebrated today, May the 25th, 1963, back in Ethiopia. That's when the organization was founded. But of course, Thabo Mbeki playing such a pivotal role in how this organization then changed into becoming the African Union. And you remember that many years ago when he delivered that speech in Parliament where he spoke about I'm an African, and this is something that keeps on resonating with many South Africans. I was even seeing on Twitter people keep on saying that, can't you please repeatedly play this poem that Thabo Mbeki delivered in Parliament, saying that I am an African. Let's just quickly speak more about today's lecture, and of course today's lecture being focusing on the role of women, but quite specifically gender empowerment. And right now I'm joined by the United Nations Women Representative here in South Africa, Githuku-Shongwe, joining us this afternoon. I guess it's quite important that when we speak about Africa and we speak about her children, you cannot forget the women.
No, good evening. You cannot forget the women because we birthed this nation, this continent. But also we are 50%, in many countries, more than 51% of the population of these countries. But we hold so much of the productivity that goes on in the African continent. Do you know that across West Africa in particular, more than 70% of the economies come from women informal traders? And that even if South Africa has got a very strong private sector, we still have women both in the formal sector, but in the informal sector as well, who keep the wheels of productivity running across this African continent. So it's critical.
Yeah. Just earlier on, actually, we are playing a clip from Ronald Lamolas representing the ANC on this debate around land expropriation without compensation. Of course, this being such a huge debate. And I remember about a couple of months ago when this issue was being debated at the GIPS at the business school, the Gordon Institute Business School. And I said to him that looking at the panel that is discussing this issue, they are all male. Yet we know for a matter of fact that when you look at rural economy of this country and probably of the continent as a whole, women play a pivotal role. Why aren't they being brought in to have these discussions about land ownership?
Well, actually, there is a big conversation going on by women and those who work with women and women's organizations about land and rural development. But obviously, it depends on who Gibbs was speaking to, because actually the Commission for Gender Equality has got a huge campaign running right now called 1 Hectare, 1 Woman. And the intention is to ensure that every South African woman who is in rural areas has the opportunity to be productive and be able to use the land in a productive way. But the way in which South Africa has been organized structurally, women in general, without having the kind of income to purchase land, are unable to own land and be able to actually access land and be effective in farming or in the agricultural sector, all across the agricultural business value chains. So there is a conversation that's going, and I think it's a question of really being able to put the conversations at Gibbs with the conversations where women are, and as I said, the Commission for Gender Equality leading that debate.
And actually, some countries on the continent, there are these cultural norms where women are not even allowed to own land.
In fact, this is still present in many countries. I'm married to a wonderful man from Swaziland, and when we got married, at that time, this is 20 or so years ago, I immediately, in principle, based on the law of the land, became a legal minor, which means that I could not own land. I could not own land, and the only way I could access land is through a male relative, through my husband or through my son or through my father, and that was the only way. And it still happens in that way because national land is owned in trust for the people, especially rural land that is considered royal land, is controlled by chiefs and traditional leaders. So that's still the case. You still have to have very strong relationships with traditional leaders to be able to access land. But of course there is privately owned land, and the issue that we have right now is that so much of the privately owned land is in the hands of wealthy commercial farmers who would have to work with a willing seller, willing buyer current policy. And that doesn't provide a lot of option and opportunity for women who don't have. But where we do find that women are owning land, and we've been working with the Department of Rural Development and Agriculture, with women smallholder farmers. This is a growing community that are increasingly farming the land and being able to actually provide. And right now we're supplying the World Food Programme with food for them to distribute across Africa. The ownership of land, the women that we work with own land, but they're small pieces of land, and the opportunity to expand real agricultural productivity from smallholder farmers, which is much more effective than even commercial farming, is still yet to be achieved.
And how do you make sure that you get women to be part of these conversations, get women's voices to be heard? Because I guess it doesn't help having the commission having a discussion all by itself and not having this discussion, for instance, at GIBS for that matter, where you have the agri-essays of this world who would come and discuss how land expropriation without compensation would have an impact on their businesses, for instance, and not speaking about how it would have an impact on ensuring that even women own a piece of this land.
Well, I think the conversations are at different levels. So obviously the big conversation is at the government level, so that you make sure that legislatively women have access to land, and that it's structurally defined so that women can access this land. So a lot of the work, and you've heard the president even as recently as yesterday in his budget vote being talking about how important this issue is. And so women are participating in those conversations through political parties, of course, but also in this conversation we're talking about with the Gender Commission. It's not a conversation that's happened just inside the Gender Commission. The Gender Commission represents large organizations, and so there are conversations that the Commission is having with different women, and we are increasingly having colloquia and really looking at what could this look like? What are the opportunities for moving land into women's hands, but also preparing women to be able to take that land into productive markets? Because one of the biggest things is that it's one thing to be able to have women produce, it's another thing for the markets to be ready. And so part of what the work that we're doing is trying to ensure that the buyers of food, the big companies that actually buy food, buy from women. Because what we know is that government goods and services that are procured and that are bought, and private sector companies, barely 7% to 8% of that goes towards women. And so the idea is to really push companies, whether it's the Woolworths or the ShopRites and the big companies, fruit and veg, at a sort of country level. We want those companies to buy 50% from women farmers. When there is demand from the women, from the companies, then the women have a direct market to supply. And there's a platform that we've been designing as UN Women globally, and we're working on this in Rwanda, where women farmers placed in a platform, so they're registered in a platform, the size of the land, the yield, the kind of products that they produce, alongside companies that buy from women. So this Buy From Women platform has enabled women in Rwanda, in rural Rwanda, 3,500 of them, to actually produce much higher yield, because they now have actual orders from the Rwanda Grain Association. So we're bringing this platform to South Africa so that they are easily accessible. Because one of the things we hear from companies, big companies that we challenge to buy from women, what they say is that we can't find the women. So a lot of what we've been working with the South Africa Women in Farming Association, and working with different women's organizations, cooperatives, to get them to organize themselves so that they're able to supply and have the kind of quality that is required for the market.
Do you think legislation would help at all, to have a stipulated legislation that says that we as government shall buy 30%, and the expectation is that you should buy 30% of all the goods and services from companies owned by women, and we expect the same from private companies to also make sure that they purchase from companies being run by women.
Absolutely. In fact, this is one of our big agendas. One of the things that we've just done a study to be able to understand, what are the barriers to women being able to supply. The country has a regulation on procurement from women, people with disabilities, from youth, from small businesses, but it is not legislated yet. And this is something that we're waiting on, something that we're working on. And the intention is to ensure that 30% purchase is required and is part of the KPI of every single government department. And we don't want to relegate women to catering and some of the smaller events management, and that's okay to do, but we don't want to relegate that, because the real power that's going to shift this economy is when women are actually supplying large-scale business infrastructure, etc. But the issue we have is that one of the biggest barriers is that the control and the decision-making around who government and the private sector buys from is the procurement and supply officers. It's an old boys club. It's a club of people who've had these interactions for decades, and women don't have access to enter that. So we're working on creating a replica of what is being done in Kenya, an access to government procurement opportunities type of initiative that will enable both government to make the effort to reach women, but also for women themselves to be able to be positioned to actually meet that demand.
Just quickly before I let you go, here's another issue. You speak about the reluctance that seems to be coming from corporate. There's an initiative being run now by the Nelson Mandela Foundation summiting Mount Everest, for instance, and when they're challenging companies to donate sanitary towels to a girl child, come on board. But there seems to be that reluctance from the private sector to come on board, even if it means reducing the price of sanitary towels, for that matter.
Well, I think there has to be a dramatic shift at the level of CEOs of companies across this country. And what we've been doing is basically we have a global initiative called He for She, where we have champions, CEOs who take the initiative and commit to delivering for women. So companies like Unilever are part of that. And we actually measure the performance, and it comes directly from the CEO, where we're measuring how it is that they're delivering for women. And so even on this issue of sanitary hygiene, companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble who produce some of these, one of the challenges to say to them, how do you work with us to zero rate sanitary pads so that companies, so that girls can actually get them for free in the way you get free food and the way condoms are supplied for free. In fact, on Monday and Tuesday, there's a huge conference that's going on in Johannesburg about maternal health, and this issue is at the center of it. There's lots of small businesses now that are actually manufacturing low-cost sanitary pads, many of them run by women themselves. And the issue is whether or not they will be the ones that supply government, but we know that the Department of Women is working on an initiative to ensure that there's free sanitary wear. The private sector, on the other hand, of course, for them it's revenue, and so we're pushing them to say, contribute, invest, push, so that this becomes a free opportunity for young girls and they can go to school free of costs.
Well, I guess the struggle still continues.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. Yes, there you have it from Anne, speaking about some of the issues that women, especially the girl child, is facing at the moment, and the discussion that will be happening later on when the lecture is delivered. There will be a panel discussion that will look into the speech or the lecture that has been delivered by Mayor Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka about the challenges that women are facing. And you know that she's been the Executive Secretary of UN Women over a couple of years. So a couple of researchers that she has, that UN Women has been looking into as well. And those are some of the aspects that will be spoken about this evening. And some other thing, for instance, if you look at the Pan-African Parliament, they have a legislation that says that each country must send 3 people to represent that country as a member of parliament, yet the threshold is only set at 1 woman instead of 2, for instance. How do governments ensure that they challenge those bias that women face globally and here on the continent? Well, as I've indicated, the lecture will be run about 7 o'clock this evening, and of course SABC News will be carrying it live.
That is Aldrin Sampear live to us from UNISA in Pretoria. It is time for a quick ad break. We're back with news on top of the hour.